The night sky has always been more than just a canvas of stars. To the ancient mind, it was alive, an ocean of eyes staring back, a cathedral ceiling where gods, spirits, and watchers dwelled in silence. When humanity finally built the machines to pierce that silence, we believed we were entering empty territory, a new frontier, a barren, waiting world. But silence is deceptive. Silence can hide, silence can watch. In the early days of NASA, before Apollo's triumphant leap to the moon, there were already murmurs, tiny cracks in the carefully polished mirror of official history. Engineers trading hushed rumors in fluorescent-lit offices. Mission controllers speaking off-record about odd interruptions on the comm channels. Amateur radio operators, those solitary listeners who tuned their antennas toward the heavens, swore they had captured fragments of conversations never meant for public ears. What they described was not triumph. It was unease, astronauts speaking in tones that didn't match the transcripts later released, voices describing objects moving near the spacecraft, lights that flickered and danced just beyond the window, static that seemed alive as though carrying more than interference. NASA, of course, was swift to dismiss. They called it misinterpretation, technical glitches, the artifacts of long-distance transmission. But glitches do not leave astronauts sounding frightened. Glitches do not inspire silence that lingers decades after the fact. Consider the context. The United States was not only racing the Soviets to the moon, it was racing the unknown. Every launch was a gamble, every orbit a step into an environment humanity had never truly touched. And yet, beyond the technical risks, something stranger seemed to shadow those missions. Something observers later said looked less like chance and more like surveillance. Could it be that, when humanity first pushed into the cosmic ocean, it discovered it was not alone at sea? Even in official histories, odd gaps remain. Strange pauses in audio transmissions, mysterious blackout periods where communication cut out with no clear explanation. To some, these silences were evidence of censorship, moments when astronauts reported things too sensitive to release. To others, they were coincidence, an artifact of the distance between Earth and Moon. But coincidences begin to lose their comfort when they repeat, when they echo across multiple missions, whispered by different men who shared the same haunted look after returning home. Perhaps the most chilling thought is not that the astronauts saw something. It's that they saw something, reported it, and then were told never to speak of it again. The Apollo program gave humanity its greatest achievement, the first steps on another world. Yet hidden beneath that achievement lies a shadowed question: what else was waiting there? The stars, after all, have been watching us far longer than we have been watching them. What if the first steps on the moon were not as lonely as we were told? The Apollo missions did not unfold in a vacuum of pure science. They were born in the fire and paranoia of the Cold War. Every rocket launch was more than exploration, it was a declaration, a message to the world: we can reach higher, faster, farther than our rivals. But when nations fight to claim the heavens themselves may reveal secrets neither side expects. In Washington and Moscow, men in suits watched the stars as if they were chessboards. Satellites were pawns, rockets were knights. The moon was the ultimate prize. Yet amid this battle for supremacy, a quieter fear whispered through the ranks: what if we were not the only players? Declassified records now show the military's uneasy fascination with unidentified aerial phenomena long before the word UFO entered pop culture. Pilots during the Korean War described glowing objects outrunning jets. Early missile tests were reportedly shadowed by strange lights. And when the first American astronauts orbited Earth, some returned with accounts that didn't fit neatly into NASA's press releases. Gordon Cooper, one of the Mercury 7, openly admitted later in life that he had witnessed craft he believed were not of this earth. Others spoke more carefully, with the hesitation of men bound by unseen chains. Still, their eyes betrayed the weight of memory. Officially, NASA dismissed such accounts as reflections, lens flares, or cosmic rays. But reflections do not pace a spacecraft for hundreds of miles. Cosmic rays do not maneuver with intelligent precision. Inside Mission Control, every unexplained blip on a radar was catalogued, every silence on the open channel carefully reviewed. But when the official story was written, these anomalies vanished, scrubbed clean, as though history itself had been laundered. Why the public reason was fear of mass panic, of giving the Soviets an opening to mock American credibility, but some insiders whisper of another reason, that if the truth were admitted, that Apollo astronauts might not have been alone, the very foundations of the Cold War narrative would have cracked, because in that moment, humanity's enemy would not have been each other. It would have been something else, something larger, something watching. And so the cover-up, if we call it that, did not begin with Apollo. It began long before, in those tense corridors of power where every secret was weighed not for truth, but for its usefulness. The moon, to the public, was a dream. To the generals, it was high ground. But in the darker corners of classified files, another possibility lurked. The moon was already occupied. That possibility terrified them. Because if the Soviet Union was dangerous, imagine what could be hiding in the silence between stars. In the Cold War, every secret was a weapon, but what if some secrets were not even human? We often imagine astronauts as fearless heroes, calm under pressure, smiling for cameras, immortalized in parades. But behind the polished image was a burden that few could carry without scars. The Apollo astronauts were not only explorers. They were symbols, living instruments of a national dream. Every movement, every word, every silence was scrutinized by governments, by rivals, by history itself. When they strapped into their capsules, they did so knowing death hovered inches away. Yet it wasn't only the threat of malfunction or fire. There was a deeper, quieter weight pressing down, the awareness that they might encounter something no one had prepared them for, something their training manuals had no chapter for. Their families felt it too. Wives carried the silent terror of raising children who might wake up fatherless. Kids grew up learning that their fathers belonged first to NASA, second to the flag, and only third to their own family. And when the astronauts did return home, they were changed. They had seen Earth from above, fragile and shimmering, but they had also seen other things. Buzz Aldrin once admitted that on the way to the moon, he observed an object that seemed to follow Apollo 11. At first, he thought it could be a piece of the rocket that had detached, but the longer he looked, the less sense it made. He later spoke of it cautiously, then retracted, then clarified, his words shifting like sand under pressure. His eyes, though, told the story of a man haunted by what he couldn't fully say. Neil Armstrong was even more reserved, a man of profound integrity, yet one who avoided direct questions about certain moments on the moon. At a White House dinner years later, he gave a cryptic toast. "We have only completed the beginning. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers." What was he hinting at? What protective layers was he speaking of? Some believe it was metaphor, others believe it was confession. The burden was not only what they saw, but what they could not say. Imagine being the first humans to walk another world, yet forced to guard secrets you never asked to carry. To live knowing that the most extraordinary moments of your life could never be spoken aloud. That every time you looked at the moon, you remembered not just triumph, but something else, something unexplainable, something silenced. This is the part of the story that rarely makes the textbooks. The emotional toll, the sleepless nights. The haunted looks in the eyes of men who had touched another world, but seemed more distant, more unreachable after coming home. It was not only the weight of history pressing on their shoulders, it was the weight of mystery. Heroes return from battle with medals, but what do you give to a hero who returns carrying silence? If the moon landings were theater, then the radio waves were the invisible stage. Every word, every breath of the astronauts was carried across space, bounced back to Earth, filtered through mission control, and then delivered to a global audience. But what the world heard was not always what was truly said. Amateur radio operators, those patient night watchers with homemade antennas, claimed to pick up something different. They tuned into side channels, strange frequencies bleeding from NASA's official stream, and what they reported was unsettling. Snippets of conversations that never appeared in the public transcripts. Astronauts describing glowing lights. Urgent voices asking, "Do you see it too?" Moments of static that ended abruptly, as if cut off mid-sentence. NASA denied it, of course. They explained that ham operators must have misunderstood, intercepted noise, or fabricated their accounts, but the consistency of these reports made some pause. Different listeners, in different countries, all describing similar things, astronauts seeing objects that weren't supposed to be there. Then there are the so-called lost tapes. Stories circulate of audio recordings quietly stored, mislabeled, or erased. According to some accounts, Apollo 11's transmissions contained a hidden channel, one where Armstrong and Aldrin spoke privately to mission control about strange structures on the moon's surface. The claim is controversial, dismissed by skeptics, but it persists in the law of disclosure. Imagine it, millions of people listening, united in awe, as humans walked the moon for the first time. Yet behind the curtain, another conversation was unfolding, one the public was never meant to hear. The astronauts' voices, carried through static, seemed different on these alleged private channels, more restrained, less rehearsed, at times almost frightened. "They're here," one supposed fragment reads, "they're watching us." Even if these transmissions are myths, their power lies in their persistence. Decades later, people still tell the same stories, as if the radio waves themselves carry an echo that refuses to die. Why does this matter? Because silence is not neutral. When gaps appear in the record, when stories vanish or are buried, suspicion fills the void. A mystery is born not from what we hear, but from what we are not allowed to hear. NASA built its reputation on openness, on live broadcasts and transparency. Yet what if transparency itself was a mask, a carefully curated performance to reassure the public while hiding the unexplainable just out of view? The radio waves are gone now, dissolved into the endless sea of static that surrounds our planet. But the echoes remain, in rumor, in whispers, in the haunted pauses of the men who carried those secrets home. What if silence itself is hiding a secret? Every great journey begins with expectations. For Apollo, the expectation was triumph, plant the flag, collect the rocks, return as heroes. But the reality, if the whispers are true, was more complicated. Because when humanity set foot on the moon, it may not have been stepping into emptiness. It may have been stepping into someone else's domain. Whispers of other visitors on the lunar surface have lingered for decades. Former NASA insiders, engineers, contractors, even military personnel have quietly suggested that the Apollo astronauts saw more than just craters and dust, that they saw objects, craft, even structures that appeared artificial. The stories vary, but they share a chilling consistency. Reports of tall formations casting unnatural shadows, glimmers of metallic shapes on the horizon, lights that appeared to follow the lunar module as it descended. The astronauts' voices, clipped and coded, seemed to circle these moments without naming them directly, as if they knew their words were being watched as closely as their actions. In some versions of the tale, Armstrong himself is said to have spoken on a private channel, describing massive objects lined up at the edge of a crater. According to this account, mission control fell silent. Then, in a calm but urgent tone, ordered him to continue with the mission and say nothing further. Skeptics argue these are exaggerations, the fever dreams of UFO enthusiasts. Yet something about the persistence of the story makes it difficult to dismiss entirely. Why has it followed Apollo for half a century? Why does it refuse to fade? Perhaps because it speaks to something primal. The fear that when we finally crossed into the heavens, we were trespassers. That the moon was never truly empty, but a doorway, an entrance to a mystery far older than our rockets, older than our wars, older than the very idea of history. The astronauts returned to Earth, smiling for the cameras, carrying samples of lunar soil and rocks. But what else did they carry? What memories, what sights, what silences lingered in the private corners of their minds? It is here, at the edge of Act I, that the story begins to shift, from triumph to unease, from celebration to secrecy. Because if the Apollo missions truly brushed against the unknown, then the greatest cover-up in human history may have begun not in the darkness of conspiracy forums, but on the brightest stage humanity ever built. The question remains, did we discover the moon, or did the moon discover us? The door to the unknown had been opened, and once opened, it could never fully close again. What if the first giant leap was also the first trespass? On July 20th, 1969, 500 million people leaned forward in awe as Neil Armstrong's voice crackled through the void. That's one small step for man, but according to persistent whispers, what the public heard was only part of the transmission. Somewhere between the official broadcast and the raw feed, there were gaps, moments of silence that carried more weight than words. Amateur radio operators, tuning into frequencies outside NASA's polished stream, claimed to intercept something else. A hidden channel, a conversation that didn't match the one delivered to the world. In those fragments, if they are to be believed, Armstrong and Aldrin spoke in hushed tones about objects waiting near the crater. Shapes, luminous and still, arranged as though in silent formation. One voice, tense and low, allegedly said, "They're here lined up on the other side of the crater, watching us." Of course, NASA denied it. Engineers dismissed the story as fantasy, a fabrication by conspiracy theorists eager to inject mystery into triumph. And yet, the story refuses to die. It drifts through decades like a phantom signal, unverified yet strangely persistent. Some former insiders have quietly fueled the fire. Retired employees hint that there was indeed a secondary communication loop, an emergency channel separate from the public feed. Not proof of UFOs, but proof that the public was never hearing the full conversation. If such a channel existed, what else might it have carried? The silence itself became suspicious. Why did so many of the astronauts' transmissions include sudden pauses, clipped exchanges, moments when their tone shifted from calm professionalism to something almost restrained? Was it the stress of history, or was it the pressure of knowing that their most extraordinary words could never be spoken aloud? Consider this: Armstrong was a man of precision, a test pilot who measured his words. Yet years later, when asked about mysteries on the moon, he offered a strange reflection. He spoke of protective layers of truth, not lies, layers, as if the truth was there but hidden under veils, waiting for those willing to peel them back. The idea of a silent channel fits that metaphor. A layer of truth beneath the broadcast, heard only by a few, erased from the official story but carried forward by rumor. If the Apollo 11 astronauts truly saw something extraordinary, then history's most iconic moment, the moon landing, was also history's most carefully edited performance. Humanity was allowed to see the flag, the footprints, the glory, but what was withheld What did the silence conceal? Sometimes it is not the words we hear that matter most. It is the words withheld. And so Act II begins not with clarity, but with static fragments of a conversation lost in the deep ocean of radio waves. A phantom signal still echoing, asking us to listen more closely. Space is supposed to be dark, empty, silent, but again and again, Apollo astronauts reported something else, a dance of flickering lights that seemed to trail, pace, or circle their spacecraft like watchful companions. During Apollo 11's journey, both Armstrong and Aldrin described a strange object glinting just beyond the window. At first, they thought it might be part of the rocket, one of the panels jettisoned earlier in the flight. But when they tracked its movement, doubt crept in. The object seemed to keep pace too perfectly, as though intentionally observing them. Later, Aldrin spoke carefully about this. He admitted that he and Armstrong saw something, but then, almost as quickly, he explained it away. Debris, he said, though he could never fully prove it. His hesitation, the long pauses in his interviews, left listeners unsettled. It was the tone of a man trying to honor truth while protecting a secret he never asked to carry. And it wasn't just Apollo 11. Apollo 12 reported strange flashes outside the command module. Apollo 13, already cursed by its near-fatal malfunction, described glowing objects in the distance. Apollo 14's crew mentioned streaks of light moving against the star field, maneuvers that didn't fit the behavior of meteors or space junk. NASA's official explanations were predictable: ice crystals reflecting sunlight, equipment fragments tumbling away, optical illusions. Yet pilots trained to fly at the edge of life and death do not confuse reflections for solid craft. They know the difference between a glimmer of dust and an object holding formation. To dismiss the astronauts' words so easily is to underestimate the eyes of men who had been sharpened by thousands of flight hours, men whose survival depended on noticing the slightest anomaly. The flickering lights seemed to haunt them, not only in space, but afterward. Some astronauts spoke of them years later, almost reluctantly, as though the memory pressed against their silence until it escaped in small fragments. Others avoided the subject entirely, their silence heavier than any denial. What makes the lights so haunting is their subtlety. They did not attack. They did not announce themselves. They hovered, flickered, watched, almost as if testing, almost as if waiting. Imagine the psychological weight of that realization. You are the first of your species to step beyond the cradle of Earth, yet something is already there, hovering just out of reach, acknowledging your presence but withholding its purpose. Were they guardians, observers, or simply indifferent travelers sharing the same ocean of stars? Whatever they were, the lights remained unspoken in the official narrative. Yet in the unguarded moments, in the flicker of hesitation on a veteran astronaut's face, the memory still burns. Not all lights guide us home. Some remind us we are not alone. Space-to-Earth communication was supposed to be clear, continuous, and recorded for history. Every breath, every word, every fragment of static between the Apollo astronauts and Houston was preserved, or so the public was told. Yet within the shadows of those transmissions lies a rumor too persistent to ignore, the idea that mission control sometimes muted the line. That when an astronaut spoke words that could not be allowed to echo into the living rooms of Earth, a private channel was opened, and the public feed fell into carefully crafted silence. On Apollo 11, moments after the historic landing, Armstrong allegedly switched frequencies. The words that followed were never broadcast, but whispers claim he reported other ships watching from the rim of a crater. NASA denies this, of course, calling it fabrication. And yet the story refuses to die, retold by engineers, journalists, and even retired personnel who hint that fragments of truth slip through the cracks. Imagine the control room, rows of engineers, their faces bathed in the glow of green monitors. A voice cuts through, an astronaut describing something impossible. In that instant, the decision is made. Fingers hover over switches, channels are rerouted, the world hears only static. And then the official voice returns, calm and composed. "Roger, we copy you." The contrast is haunting. The astronauts on the moon sounded tense, distracted. The transcripts read clean, polished, without hesitation, as though someone had combed through the raw fabric of history and ironed it smooth. Skeptics argue the idea is absurd. Why risk tampering with the greatest achievement in human history? Why complicate perfection with conspiracy? Yet those same skeptics rarely address the gaps, moments where audio cuts off abruptly, where exchanges are missing from public logs, where private channels allegedly carried conversations meant only for classified ears. Even NASA's own archives betray the mystery. Some reels of Apollo footage are missing. Entire transmissions have been labeled lost. When questioned, officials shrug. Tapes were erased, reused, misplaced. A strange fate for the most important recordings ever made by humankind. It is in this silence, deliberate or accidental, that the imagination begins to stir. Were the astronauts describing strange lights again, shapes moving along the horizon, or was it something far more direct, an intelligence making its presence known at the very moment humanity took its first step beyond the cradle? For the astronauts, such moments must have been suffocating. To speak words into the void, knowing the world might never hear them. To describe what their eyes could see, only to watch the signal vanish under the weight of control. Silence, after all, can be louder than truth. And in the silence of Houston, one question remains. Who was the silence really protecting? The astronauts, the public, or the secret itself? Perhaps the greatest transmissions of all time are the ones we never heard. When the astronauts returned from their missions, the public saw them as heroes, paraded through streets, smiling under showers of confetti. But behind the cameras, in closed rooms, they faced something far more sobering: the debriefings. These sessions were meant to be clinical, procedural. Every observation logged, every anomaly dissected. Yet fragments of testimony suggest the debriefings held more than just technical analysis. They held whispers, carefully worded comments, evasive pauses, a language of suggestion spoken between men who had seen too much. Neil Armstrong, famously reserved, often deflected questions about strange lights or objects. He rarely said no. Instead, he would tilt the conversation, leaving answers vague. A silence here, a quiet smile there, as if confirming something without daring to pronounce it. Buzz Aldrin, years later, admitted to seeing an object following Apollo 11, but in the official debriefing, he downplayed it, almost rehearsed. He spoke of panels from the Saturn V, a possibility, nothing more. Yet the hesitation in his voice told another story, one of a man balancing truth against consequence. Others followed the same pattern. Apollo 12's Charles Conrad once joked cryptically about company out there. Was it humor masking tension, or a slip too easily dismissed as playfulness? Apollo 14's Edgar Mitchell, more daring, later confessed to his belief in extraterrestrial presence. But in the official sessions, his words were measured, careful, as if shadowed by an invisible hand. What if these whispers were not accidents? What if they were the astronauts' only outlet, a way to record what they saw without breaking the pact of silence? A language coded in hesitation, irony, and omission. Reports also tell of moments when psychologists sat in on these debriefings, monitoring not just the astronauts' words, but their expressions, their stress levels, their body language. It was not only science being studied, it was the human reaction to the unknown. And sometimes the transcripts themselves feel incomplete. Pages are missing, sections redacted, questions unanswered. For events that should have been documented with military precision, there are strangely blurred edges, as though history itself was carefully edited. The debriefings leave us with a dual image of the astronauts, heroes who carried the weight of human exploration, and silent witnesses who carried a truth they could not easily share. To look at their eyes during those press conferences, the tight smiles, the weary gazes, is to sense the burden, not just the exhaustion of the journey, but the unspoken memory of what stood outside the spacecraft windows, watching. If they could not speak freely in those rooms, if the truth was smothered even there, then where could it live? Perhaps it lived in the pauses, in the whispers, in the quiet moments when history's brightest men allowed their guard to slip. Sometimes the loudest testimony is not in what is said, but in what is carefully left unsaid. In the vaults of NASA, history should have been safe. Every second of Apollo, every word spoken across that fragile distance, every flicker of video, the most precious archive of human achievement. But when researchers and archivists went searching, something inexplicable emerged. Some of the most important recordings were missing. Gone. The official explanation was almost mundane. NASA admitted that certain reels, hundreds of original Apollo telemetry and videotapes, were erased and reused during the 1980s. At the time, magnetic tape was expensive. Budgets were tight. So the most priceless documents in the history of exploration were wiped clean to record weather data. The excuse stunned even loyal defenders of the agency. Why erase tapes that contained humanity's first steps on another world? Why not preserve them in the most secure archive on Earth? And why, out of all possible recordings, were the Apollo reels among those accidentally recycled? For skeptics, this was no mistake, it was an erasure, a deliberate cleansing of evidence. Because those tapes may have contained more than the sanitized versions shown to the public, whispers suggest the original footage showed anomalies, strange lights hovering near the lunar horizon, unexplained interruptions, perhaps even audio that spoke of visitors. What the world saw on television was history sculpted into a perfect image. What the erased reels might have shown could have shattered that image. A few fragments survived, copies degraded by time and format, and even there, researchers note peculiarities, strange flashes, odd distortions, moments when the camera pans just wide enough to suggest something beyond the frame. Always on the edge of perception, as though the truth was hiding just outside the picture. Some insiders tell of locked vaults, where copies of the unedited transmissions still exist, guarded under layers of classification. Others insist the reels were lost forever, destroyed not out of secrecy, but negligence. Yet negligence on this scale feels stranger than secrecy. For in the history of human civilization, what artifact could be more valuable than the unfiltered record of our first contact with another world? The missing tapes have become legend, the phantom archive of Apollo. Scholars, journalists, even filmmakers have hunted them. Lawsuits have been filed, FOIA requests submitted, whispers chased through bureaucratic corridors. The answer is always the same: they're gone, erased, misplaced. But absence, in its own way, is evidence. Because when something so vital is missing, the silence it leaves behind grows louder than any official explanation. What might we have seen in those erased reels? A barren landscape, exactly as described, or something more, shadows that should not be there, movements on the horizon, lights flickering in formation. Until the day they resurface, if they ever do, the phantom tapes remain a wound in history. Sometimes what is missing tells us more than what remains. In every story of secrecy, there are always a few who slip. Men who, whether out of conscience, pride, or simple human need, cannot keep the silence forever. The Apollo era was no different. Some astronauts, disciplined, loyal, bound by oaths, remained cautious for life, but others left behind fragments. A sentence here, a half-joke there, and sometimes words that seem to carry more weight than intended. Take Gordon Cooper, Mercury astronaut, and one of NASA's golden boys. He was never shy about his belief in UFOs. Cooper once testified to seeing strange craft during his Air Force career. Later, he admitted that a film crew under his supervision had captured footage of a disc-shaped object landing at Edwards Air Force Base. The film, he said, was sent to Washington, never to be seen again. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14's lunar pioneer, went further. In interviews after his retirement, he spoke openly of extraterrestrial presence, of government knowledge, of cover-ups that stretched back decades. "We are not alone," he said with calm certainty, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had walked on the moon. Yet, in his official NASA role, he had never said those words. Why the difference? Then there are the cryptic slips. Charles Conrad's casual remarks about company out there. James Lovell's offhand comments about bogies during Apollo missions. To the public, they passed as jokes or miscommunications, but to those who listen closely, they sound like fragments of something more, a nervous truth disguised as humor. Even Buzz Aldrin, when speaking to a Science Channel years later, described the Apollo 11 sighting of an unidentified object. At first, he softened it as debris, but then he added, "We weren't certain what it was." That uncertainty hung in the air, heavier than any conclusion. And what of the engineers, the technicians, the controllers at Houston? Some of them, long after retirement, whispered about muted channels, about astronauts describing visitors on private frequencies. Their accounts were scattered, unverifiable, yet consistent in their echoes, too many voices aligning around the same shadow. But the men who talked too much often paid a price. Their words were dismissed, their reputations quietly undermined. They were framed as eccentric, agging, or confused. To admit belief in UFOs was to invite ridicule, even for national heroes. And so their truths, if truths they were buried under laughter and doubt. Still, the whispers remain. They travel like ghosts through interviews, lectures, and late-night conversations. They remind us that even within the silence, some voices try to rise. The question lingers, were these men careless, reckless, or were they trying, in the only way they could, to slip the truth into the public record? In a world of silence, sometimes the smallest whispers are the loudest warnings. On the surface, the Apollo record appears flawless, every maneuver documented, every conversation transcribed, every anomaly explained away with scientific neatness. But when you hold the pieces up to the light, the seams begin to show. Take the transcripts. NASA released thousands of pages, line by line, documenting the astronauts' words. They are dry, precise, almost sterile, yet compare them with the raw audio that survives, and subtle differences appear. Phrases missing, pauses smoothed, context erased. It is as if the record was edited not just for clarity, but for control. Consider Apollo 11's journey to the moon. The official log makes no mention of unusual objects, yet Buzz Aldrin himself, in later years, openly described the crew seeing something trailing their spacecraft. Why is there no trace of that conversation in the mission transcripts? Why is it relegated to interviews decades later, softened with half-explanations? Or Apollo 13, the mission nearly lost to disaster. The crew reported strange flashes of light outside their windows, even as they struggled to survive. In the official documents, those flashes are listed briefly, dismissed as cosmic rays. But astronauts were trained to recognize cosmic rays. The language they used at the time suggests something more, something moving, something patterned. The contradiction lingers like static on the line. Then there are the mission reports, carefully compiled by engineers. Some mention anomalies with cryptic brevity, using phrases like unidentified object observed. Without follow-up, others omit them entirely, as if scrubbing clean what should have raised questions. Even photographs tell a story of conflict. Officially, the Apollo archive contains thousands of images, curated into a pristine record. Yet early researchers noted curious anomalies, lights where no stars should be, streaks across the lunar sky, reflections that suggest shapes outside the frame. NASA attributes these to lens flares, scratches, film artifacts. Perhaps they are. But why do they appear most often in the missions where astronauts themselves whispered of strange company? Each contradiction on its own can be explained. Optical illusions, misremembered testimony, data lost in the noise of history. But together they form a pattern, a puzzle whose missing pieces feel deliberate. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. The contradictions are not blunt, not obvious. They are subtle, almost delicate, like fingerprints left by someone who thought they could wipe the glass clean, but couldn't quite erase every trace. For those who dig into the archives, the contradictions spark endless debate. Are they signs of a hidden layer of truth, or are they the natural imperfections of a massive historical project, stretched by human error and time? In the end, the contradictions leave us staring at the record like a mosaic with cracks running through it. The image is still there, but we sense something beneath it, trying to break through. When history is too perfect, we must ask, what has been sacrificed to make it so? The early Apollo missions had been wrapped in triumph, heroes returning from the heavens, the nation basking in the glow of victory. But beneath the golden surface, shadows were beginning to gather. Strange reports, missing tapes, muted transmissions, contradictions in the record. They did not fade with time, they multiplied. Inside NASA, rumors spread quietly among engineers and staff. Stories of conversations that never reached the public. Reports of anomalous phenomena tucked into classified memos. Whispers of surveillance, not only of astronauts, but of those who dared to ask too many questions. Even the astronauts themselves carried a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each mission. They returned changed, more guarded. Smiles at press conferences looked thinner, their eyes more distant. The public saw heroes. Their families saw men who woke in the night, haunted by something they would not speak of. Journalists, too, began to sense the cracks. Some pressed gently, asking about the strange lights or missing audio. They were met with laughter, dismissal, or sudden changes of subject. Others pushed harder, only to find doors closed, access revoked, careers quietly stifled. To question Apollo too deeply was to step into dangerous territory. And then came the intelligence community. It was no secret that the CIA and NSA had interests in space communications. Satellites tracked Apollo transmissions. Black-budget analysts combed through signals for anomalies. Some claim that even as NASA broadcasted its official feed, a second layer of monitoring ran beneath it, feeding sensitive information to agencies far removed from public view. The atmosphere grew tense. Secrecy was no longer an isolated event. It was systemic, stretching across agencies, files, and even international borders. For if Apollo astronauts had truly encountered something beyond human origin, it was not merely a scientific curiosity. It was a national security threat. And so the shadows thickened. Astronauts whispered, agencies watched, journalists probed, and families worried. The truth, whatever it was, seemed to hover just out of reach, cloaked by silence and contradiction. It was no longer just about UFOs in space. It was about power, control, and the price of knowledge. For if the truth escaped, It might reshape the very fabric of human history. Imagine being an astronaut in that moment. You've stood on another world, stared into the blackness, and seen flickering lights that moved with purpose. You've reported them, only to watch your words vanish into static. You've been debriefed, cautioned, perhaps even warned. Now you return to Earth, a hero to millions, but a prisoner to your own memories. That is the essence of the gathering shadows. Not a single secret, but a climate of secrecy, dense, suffocating, inescapable. It is not the darkness of space that unsettles us most. It is the darkness of silence, the gathering shadow that hides what we were never meant to know. By the early 1970s, the Apollo program was more than a scientific triumph. It was a stage upon which politics, intelligence, and secrecy all played their parts. Behind the engineers in white shirts and narrow ties, behind the astronauts in gleaming suits, other figures moved quietly, invisible to the public eye, yet close enough to touch every word, every image, every fragment of data. They were the hidden hands. Some wore the insignia of intelligence agencies, the CIA, the NSA, the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations. Their interest in Apollo was not purely patriotic. Space was a frontier not just for science, but for surveillance and control. Every transmission, every unexplained anomaly, every whispered word from the astronauts was a potential signal, a thread to be intercepted, classified, or buried. Rumors circulate of liaison officers embedded in NASA. Officially, they were there to coordinate security. Unofficially, their role was to filter, to decide what made it into the public record and what was quietly rerouted into classified channels. When astronauts reported strange lights, or when engineers flagged unexplained interference, these officers became the gatekeepers of truth. And then there were the contractors. Private aerospace companies built the rockets, cameras, communication systems. Employees whispered about odd directives, extra layers of encryption, footage routed to unknown locations, equipment seized after missions without explanation. When they asked questions, they were reminded of their security clearances, their obligations, their silence. The deeper one looks, the more the Apollo story begins to blur. Was it NASA's program alone, or was it also a theater where other agencies staged their own unseen operations? Some researchers argue that a dual narrative was unfolding. The public Apollo, all flags and footprints, and the shadow Apollo, where anomalies were collected, studied, hidden. Consider the missing tapes. Were they truly erased for budgetary reasons, or diverted into vaults managed not by NASA, but by agencies whose very existence thrived on secrecy? Consider the muted transmissions. Were they technical glitches, or deliberate switches controlled not from Houston's floor, but from rooms far deeper in the building, where only a select few had access? For the astronauts, the presence of these hidden hands must have been suffocating. They trained to explore, to report honestly, to serve history. Yet the moment their words crossed into the realm of the unexplained, they no longer belonged to them. They were intercepted, filtered, locked away. And for the public, the result was a carefully sculpted narrative, beautiful, inspiring, and incomplete. The hidden hands remind us that space exploration, for all its wonder, was never free from earthly power. The moon may have been silent, but on Earth, the voices of secrecy were loud enough to shape what the world would believe. Every great story has its author, but the hidden hands are the editors, cutting out the lines we were never meant to read. To the world, they were gods, men who had walked among the stars, planted flags on alien soil, and returned triumphant. Yet behind the parades and the speeches, the astronauts carried a burden that few could imagine. It was not only the memory of danger, the near misses, the mechanical failures, the bone-deep exhaustion. It was the memory of what they had seen but could not say. Families noticed it first. Husbands who came home changed. Fathers who sat in silence at the dinner table, eyes unfocused, staring into distances far beyond the walls of their homes. Wives who asked gentle questions, only to be met with evasions or sudden shifts of subject. Children who sensed the weight in the room but could never name it. Some astronauts carried it better than others. Neil Armstrong withdrew into privacy, avoiding the spotlight whenever possible. His distance was often interpreted as humility, but those who knew him well spoke of a man haunted, a man carrying more than just the history of a moonwalk. Buzz Aldrin, by contrast, spiraled into battles with depression and alcoholism. He spoke of purpose lost after Apollo, but beneath that despair, one wonders, did the silence itself contribute to his unraveling, to have witnessed something extraordinary only to live inside a narrative that denied it, can fracture the human spirit? Edgar Mitchell turned toward philosophy and the paranormal, seeking answers outside the boundaries of official science. His openness about extraterrestrial presence made him an outlier, criticized by some, revered by others. Yet perhaps this was his way of unburdening himself, of releasing what he could without breaking the oaths of secrecy. For many astronauts, the cost was subtler. The anxiety of interviews where one slip of the tongue could spark headlines, the constant awareness that their words were monitored, their reputations fragile. They had been trained to handle pressure in space, but the pressure of silence on Earth was far heavier. And then there was the paranoia. Strange cars parked outside their homes, unfamiliar voices on the phone lines, a sense that someone was always listening, always watching. Whether real or imagined, this surveillance became part of their reality, as if the very act of returning from the moon had placed them inside another kind of orbit, one defined by secrecy, suspicion, and fear. The astronauts were heroes, yes, but they were also men, men with hearts, with families, with fragile psyches, and silence, like gravity, has weight. It pulls at the soul, it bends the spirit. Their burden reminds us that the mystery of Apollo is not only cosmic, it is deeply human. The greatest secrets are not written in classified files, but in the eyes of those who lived them. The stars may lift us beyond Earth, but the silence that follows can pull us back down harder than gravity ever could. Secrecy is never just a matter of locked files. It seeps into lives, into homes, into the quiet corners of everyday existence. For the Apollo astronauts and those who worked close to them, the shadow of surveillance became part of the atmosphere they breathed. Some noticed it in small ways: a telephone line that clicked strangely when lifted, a car that seemed to idle too long near the curb, strangers who asked odd, probing questions at public events. Little things, so easy to dismiss, yet so consistent they formed a pattern. Others felt it more directly. Families recalled receiving calls that ended in silence, letters arriving opened, then resealed with clumsy care. Even friends spoke of pulling back, afraid that their association might draw unwanted attention. To live under watch is to live with unease. Every word becomes calculated. Every memory of the moon, of lights that flickered where no stars should have been, becomes heavier to carry. For the astronauts, silence was not just requested, it was reinforced. Insiders have hinted at debriefings that felt less like interviews and more like interrogations, polite on the surface, yet laced with unspoken warnings. Questions framed not only to gather information, but to remind them of boundaries, a line they were not to cross, for their own safety and perhaps for their families as well. Some former NASA contractors claimed visits from men they could not identify. Suited, calm, professional, asking about anomalies in the data. These visitors did not threaten. They didn't have to. Their presence alone was enough to freeze the tongue. The deeper question is why. If the anomalies were nothing more than debris, lens flares, or radio glitches, why maintain such a culture of intimidation? Why watch, warn, and pressure men who had already proven themselves loyal? Perhaps it was fear, not of the truth itself, but of what the truth might unleash. To admit that astronauts had seen unknown craft hovering near the moon was to open a door that could never be closed. It could destabilize faith in institutions, ignite panic, embolden rivals. And so the shadows grew, not to destroy, but to contain. Yet surveillance, by its nature, corrodes trust. It isolates those under its gaze. It turns neighbors into suspects, friends into potential informants. For the astronauts, who had once shared the unbreakable bond of survival in the void, silence began to fracture that brotherhood. Each carried his burden alone, unsure of who else might be listening. To live under surveillance is to live with a ghost. It never shows its face. It never explains its purpose. It hovers, always near, like the flickering lights outside Apollo's windows. And so, even after returning home, the astronauts remained in orbit, pulled not by the moon, but by the unseen gravity of silence and shadows. The true cost of secrecy is not in what is hidden, but in the fear that grows around it. Silence can bury the truth for a time, but silence also creates hunger. And where there is hunger, there are always those willing to chase what others fear to touch. In the years after Apollo, a handful of journalists began to notice the cracks, odd transcripts that slipped through official channels, strange inconsistencies in mission logs, whispers from technicians who had worked behind the scenes and now, decades later, felt the weight of secrets they could no longer carry. Men like George Knapp, a reporter who would later become known for his fearless UFO investigations, spoke of the difficulty of separating myth from testimony. For every solid lead, there were a dozen rumors. For every witness, a dozen skeptics. Yet the persistence of the story that the Apollo astronauts had seen things they could not explain was impossible to ignore. Other journalists dug into old radio archives, listening to static-laced recordings, hunting for anomalies. Some claimed to hear brief interruptions, coded exchanges, hurried tones that did not match the public broadcasts. Were these fragments real, or were they the creations of hopeful imaginations, bending noise into meaning? Still, the pursuit itself was dangerous. To question NASA was to risk reputation. Mainstream editors dismissed such stories as career poison. Stick to politics, some advised. Chase corruption, not shadows. But a few ignored the warnings. They chased anyway, drawn by the strange magnetism of a mystery that refused to fade. Some found themselves followed, their sources suddenly unreachable. Others described a peculiar pressure, subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that certain questions were better left unasked. One writer compared it to walking into a room where the air has already been poisoned, though no one admits it. And yet, despite the obstacles, small pieces emerged. A technician claiming to have overheard unauthorized chatter between astronauts. A contractor recalling photographs pulled from circulation at the last moment. A scientist noting data anomalies that disappeared from official reports. Individually, each account was fragile, but together they formed a constellation of suspicion, points of light suggesting a larger shape hidden behind the veil. The journalists who dared knew they might never confirm the truth, but they also knew that silence without challenge becomes permanent. And so they wrote, they questioned, they hinted, keeping alive a story that powerful forces preferred to bury. Their work did not provide answers. Instead, it created an atmosphere, a sense that something was there, just beyond reach, just beyond certainty, and perhaps that was the point. Truth, when smothered, often escapes not as fact, but as legend. Legends are what survive when facts are forbidden. And so, through the persistence of a few restless journalists, the Apollo mystery lived on, not as a headline, but as a whisper that refused to die. Every wall, no matter how carefully built, eventually shows cracks, and through those cracks, fragments of truth escape, sometimes as whispers, sometimes as shouts. In the decades after Apollo, a curious pattern began to emerge. While official statements remained consistent, nothing unusual was seen, nothing unexplained recorded. Independent researchers stumbled across anomalies that seemed to tell another story. Take the transcripts. Official mission logs were meticulously typed, catalogued, and archived. Yet versions of these transcripts occasionally surfaced in unexpected places: foreign broadcasts, private amateur recordings, even leaked photocopies. In these fragments there were oddities: lines of dialogue cut short, sudden pauses in mid-sentence, astronauts speaking in hushed tones, referencing visitors or lights in ways that did not appear in the final, polished versions. Photographs, too, carried contradictions. Some researchers claimed that early NASA image reels, those shared with partner scientists abroad, showed strange glints on the horizon or geometric shapes hovering above the lunar surface. Later releases of those same reels appeared subtly altered. Contrast levels shifted, shadows deepened, objects blurred into nothingness. Was this simply the artifact of processing technology in its infancy? Or was it evidence of quiet hands smoothing over details that did not belong? Then there were the contractors, men and women who had worked on the edges of Apollo, engineers, radio operators, data handlers, who decades later began to speak. Most did not offer dramatic revelations. Instead, they recalled small inconsistencies, signals that arrived in duplicate, as if multiple transmissions were running simultaneously. Photographs pulled suddenly from circulation with no explanation. Reports stamped classified without clear reason. Each detail was minor, yet together they formed an echo of something larger. Even other governments noticed. Soviet monitoring stations, eager to catch any mistake, claimed to intercept Apollo transmissions that never reached the public. Their archives, too, contain whispers of unexplained chatter during certain lunar orbits. While official Cold War propaganda may have embellished such claims, the mere existence of parallel records raises unsettling questions. What did NASA allow the world to hear, and what did it hold back? The contradictions created a paradox. If nothing unusual had happened, why were there gaps, edits, and sudden silences? Why did so many of those involved recall details that never reached the public record? Of course, skeptics offered explanations: faulty memory, overactive imagination, technical glitches mistaken for anomalies, and indeed, in the chaos of a space mission, such errors were inevitable. But even skeptics struggled to explain the persistence of the leaks, the way, decade after decade, small fragments of dissonance kept emerging, like notes out of tune in an otherwise perfect song. Leaks do not prove truth, but they do suggest pressure. They suggest something straining to escape containment. And so, like pieces of a broken mirror, these fragments reflected a reality that was incomplete but compelling, a reality where Apollo had been more than a triumph of engineering. Perhaps it had also been an encounter. When the story does not match the evidence, it is not the evidence that bends, it is the story. When silence is no longer enough, misdirection becomes the weapon of choice. And in the wake of Apollo, as whispers of anomalies gained traction, a second layer of control began to emerge: disinformation. It did not appear as overt censorship. Instead, it surfaced in subtler, more insidious ways. A rumor would spread about an astronaut's secret transmission, only for a debunking article to appear days later, mocking the claim with half-truths and strawman arguments. Researchers would chase what seemed to be solid evidence, only to discover it had been seeded with deliberate errors, wrong timestamps, altered transcripts, or faked photographs. The truth was not erased, it was drowned in a flood of contradictions. Some insiders described this as a containment strategy. If the public could not be shielded from every anomaly, then confusion itself would become the shield, make the story so messy, so tangled in hoaxes and exaggerations, that no one could tell fact from fiction. By the time the dust settled, the credibility of every witness, every leak, would be reduced to noise. And noise was everywhere. Tabloids ran wild with absurd tailies, moon bases, alien councils, crashed saucers hidden in lunar craters. These stories were often ridiculed, yet they had a purpose. They blurred the edges between fantasy and testimony. A genuine astronaut's uneasy admission, "We were not alone," could then be lumped alongside outlandish claims, dismissed in a single wave of the hand. The government's own involvement was never officially admitted, of course, but the fingerprints were visible. Investigators found that certain UFO-themed stories were traced back to intelligence-linked writers. Others were amplified in ways that conveniently discredited serious research. It was not suppression in the old-fashioned sense, it was weaponized ambiguity. The astronauts themselves were caught in this storm. If they spoke, their words could be twisted, exaggerated, and later used against them. If they stayed silent, they watched helplessly as their reputations became battlegrounds for speculation. Either way, the disinformation machine consumed them. Even scientists were not immune. Lunar geologists who noted anomalies in photographs suddenly found their funding cut. Radio operators who spoke too freely about intercepted transmissions were reassigned. A chilling pattern emerged. Those who questioned too loudly found themselves sidelined, ridiculed, or professionally dismantled. Disinformation is a peculiar kind of poison. It does not kill the truth outright. Instead, it contaminates the well from which everyone must drink. And so, by the late 1970s, the Apollo UFO mystery existed in a fog, half legend, half ridicule, with just enough smoke to suggest fire, yet never enough to prove it. Perhaps that was the point, a controlled chaos, a story never fully denied, never fully confirmed, a liminal space where truth itself became ungraspable. The greatest cover-up is not silence, it is the flood of false echoes that make the signal impossible to hear. Not everyone bowed to the weight of secrecy, not everyone accepted the official script. In the shadows of Apollo, a few voices emerged, quiet, trembling, often anonymous, struggling to pass fragments of truth through the cracks. Some were engineers. They had handled the data streams, the film reels, the endless telemetry pouring back from the moon. Most followed orders, but a handful copied records before they vanished. Years later, some of those records surfaced, oddly spliced tapes, photographs with unexplained markings, documents stamped restricted. Were these authentic, or were they bait, deliberately leaked to lure the curious into dead ends? Perhaps both. Others were military liaisons assigned to NASA operations. Their task was not exploration, but oversight. One former officer hinted that his role was to ensure that sensitive sightings never reached the public record. In later interviews, his voice carried the fatigue of someone who had seen too much. "We weren't hiding mistakes," he said. "We were hiding encounters." And then there were the astronauts themselves, or at least those who could not carry the silence alone. Edgar Mitchell, sixth man on the moon, became one of the most outspoken. He insisted that humanity was not alone, that contact had been made. He spoke carefully, never betraying classified details, but his words carried a resonance that could not be ignored. "There is a reality," he said, "a cosmic reality that governments fear to reveal." Other astronauts offered subtler hints. Gordon Cooper, long before Apollo, spoke openly of seeing UFOs during test flights. Buzz Aldrin once mentioned a light that trailed Apollo 11 on its way to the moon, later explained away as a detached panel, yet the uncertainty lingered. These were not confessions, but breadcrumbs, small rebellions against the suffocating demand for silence. Most whistleblowers, however, never went public. They feared ridicule or worse. Some confided only to family members, leaving stories that surfaced decades later as deathbed confessions. One technician told his daughter of a transmission gap, where astronauts reported objects hovering above the crater rim. Another admitted to handling photographs that showed structures that shouldn't exist. They died without proof, but their words remain a haunting inheritance. What unites these accounts is not clarity, but risk. Each voice knew that speaking, even in fragments, meant stepping into danger. Careers could end. Reputations could crumble. Families could be shaken by the quiet knock of an unmarked car. And yet, they spoke anyway, as if the truth itself demanded witnesses. The whistleblowers remind us that silence was never perfect. Beneath the machinery of disinformation, beneath the weight of secrecy, there were always cracks. And through those cracks came voices, imperfect, scattered, uncertain, but voices nonetheless. Truth does not need to be loud. Sometimes it survives only as a whisper, but even whispers echo in eternity. Every great mystery has two halves, what is seen and what is made unseen. If Apollo carried whispers of encounters beyond Earth, then the machinery of suppression was the force that ensured those whispers never became headlines. It did not operate with overt violence, at least not often. Its power lay in subtler methods, quiet conversations, veiled warnings, a sudden shift in one's career path. A scientist might be told that his funding had moved elsewhere. An engineer might find himself reassigned, his clearance quietly revoked. For astronauts, the threat was reputation itself. A single suggestion of instability could undo years of discipline and achievement. Fear was the lever, and it worked efficiently. One former NASA insider described it like this: you didn't need to be told twice. If you slipped, if you said something out of place, someone would remind you of the consequences. After that, you policed yourself. There were darker hints too. Researchers spoke of witnesses who abruptly withdrew after initially agreeing to interviews, their tone suddenly guarded, almost frightened. Some described visits from men who never gave names, who leaned on no official authority, but whose presence alone carried unspoken menace. A neighbor might mention seeing strangers watching from a car at night. A wife might receive an anonymous call, heavy with silence before the line clicked dead. The effect was chilling. Paranoia became self-sustaining. Even those who had never been directly approached began to live as if they were watched. The home, once sacred, became permeated by unease. Children sensed it. Families bore it. Silence was no longer just professional duty, it became survival instinct. For those who resisted, consequences rippled outward. Careers collapsed. Reputations crumbled under carefully seeded ridicule. One whistleblower recounted how colleagues suddenly treated him as unstable, even dangerous, though he had never spoken publicly. The label had been planted, and once planted, it grew like a weed, choking his credibility before he ever had the chance to speak. The astronauts were perhaps the most trapped of all. To question their silence was to risk undoing the image carefully crafted for them, disciplined, heroic, flawless. Any deviation threatened the mythology of Apollo itself. And so many withdrew, some into privacy, some into despair, some into the bottle. The machinery of suppression did not need to break them, it only needed to keep them contained. And yet silence carries its own noise. Suppression leaves a residue, an unnatural stillness, a pattern of gaps, a choreography too precise to be coincidence. The machinery may erase evidence, but in doing so, it leaves fingerprints of absence. The truest proof of a secret is not what you find, but what you are never allowed to find. Secrecy, when enforced, always leaves scars, personal, quiet, and rarely documented. But if you follow the edges of Apollo's story, you begin to see them. small testimonies, fragments of memory, echoes of fear. One former radio operator recalled the moment he mentioned strange chatter during an Apollo mission to a colleague over drinks. Within days, two men appeared at his door. They were polite, dressed in suits, their tone professional. They never raised their voices. They didn't need to. One simply said, "It would be better if you forgot what you thought you heard." The operator never spoke of it again until decades later, when his health was failing. His children said he never shook the unease, as if those men had followed him in spirit long after they left. Astronaut families, too, felt the invisible hand. A wife of one Apollo crew member recalled receiving anonymous calls late at night, no words, only breathing on the other end. At first, she dismissed it as prank calls, but when her husband returned home and told her never to speak of what he had described seeing in orbit, she began to connect the silence with the phone calls. "It was as if someone wanted me to feel what he felt," she said years later. Watched, vulnerable, afraid to even wonder. Journalists were not immune. In the 1970s, a young reporter investigating rumors of Apollo's missing transmissions was approached by individuals he later suspected were linked to intelligence. They told him he was chasing dangerous nonsense, and that pursuing it would damage his career permanently. His editor suddenly pulled the story, claiming it lacked credibility. Months later, the reporter found himself reassigned to local crime coverage, his work on aerospace completely erased. He later admitted, "It wasn't just the death of the story, it was the death of my will to ever chase another." Even technicians who handled film reels spoke of being watched. One claimed that after noticing an anomaly in a lunar photograph, something geometric at the crater's edge, his supervisor quietly advised him to never mention it again if he wanted to keep his job. Within weeks, he was reassigned to a lower security division. He took the warning to heart. He never returned to space-related work. The intimidation was rarely violent. It was precise, psychological. A reminder here, a warning there, enough to cultivate fear without creating martyrs. The brilliance of suppression lay in its subtlety, no threats to prosecute, no evidence to expose. Just shadows, always close enough to feel, never close enough to prove. And so, many of those closest to Apollo carried secrets not because they wanted to, but because fear wrapped itself around them. Their silence was not loyalty, it was survival. Fear does not silence the truth, it silences the people who carry it. From the moment President Kennedy declared that America would reach the moon, NASA became more than an agency. It became a symbol, a shining beacon of science, progress, and national pride. The Apollo missions were not simply expeditions into space. They were theater on the grandest stage, projected across televisions into every home. And that image, polished to perfection, became a shield. NASA astronauts were marketed as flawless, clean-cut test pilots, engineers of impeccable discipline, patriotic fathers and husbands. Their training emphasized not only survival in space, but composure on Earth. They were to embody calm, certainty, and loyalty. Any suggestion that they saw things beyond the official story clashed with the myth carefully constructed around them. And myths are powerful. If a journalist whispered about hidden transmissions, if a researcher mentioned anomalies in photographs, the shield of NASA's image rose instantly. Are you questioning heroes? The public would ask. Are you accusing our finest men of lying? Doubt, once cast upon the doubter, worked like gravity. It pulled suspicion away from the institution and onto the individual raising questions. After all, NASA was the trusted face of progress. To question its narrative was to challenge not just a program, but the very story of American achievement. This strategy was not unique to Apollo. Institutions throughout history have learned that the best way to bury secrets is not with silence, but with glory. Triumph blinds as effectively as intimidation. NASA leaned into this. Every press conference was tightly scripted. Every image released was framed as evidence of success. The agency flooded the world with data, overwhelming researchers with the sheer volume of information, making the anomalies harder to find, hidden in plain sight. Meanwhile, critics were marginalized. Skeptics who dared to suggest UFO encounters within Apollo were painted as conspiracy theorists, unworthy of serious attention. Mainstream science sided with NASA, further isolating alternative voices. And the public, inspired by the dream of space exploration, often defended NASA passionately, unwilling to let suspicion tarnish the golden image. It was, in many ways, the perfect defense. No need for brute force when prestige itself could silence dissent. No need for constant suppression when the very idea of doubting NASA seemed absurd. Yet shields, no matter how strong, eventually crack. Over time, whispers persisted, testimonies surfaced, and while NASA's image remained untouchable in the public eye, beneath the surface, the unease spread. Because every shield has a cost. It protects, yes, but it also hides, and in that hiding, suspicion takes root. The brighter the light of glory, the darker the shadow it casts. The world saw the astronauts as heroes. They smiled in parades, waved from convertibles, their wives at their side, their children perched proudly on their shoulders. The image was perfect, crafted to inspire, to reassure, to embody the dream of space exploration. But behind the glass of that image, the families lived another truth. Being the spouse of an astronaut was never easy. The risks of the missions alone brought sleepless nights, prayers whispered into pillows, and silent dread with every launch. But layered on top of this was a subtler weight, the weight of secrets. Many wives spoke of conversations cut short. Their husbands would begin to describe something strange, something seen in orbit, then fall silent, retreating into themselves as though realizing they had said too much. Children recalled sensing a tension in the home, a kind of heaviness that had nothing to do with rockets or re-entry. It was the heaviness of things unsaid. Some families endured anonymous phone calls, breathing on the line, or silence, or an unfamiliar voice asking if everything was fine. Neighbors noticed unmarked cars parked on quiet streets. Doors knocked at odd hours by men who flashed credentials but offered no explanations. Families were left with the chilling impression that their lives were being monitored, their privacy fragile as glass. Wives became guardians of silence too. They learned which questions not to ask, which rooms fell quiet when their husbands entered. One recalled, "I realized that protecting him meant not knowing. If I knew, I might slip, and if I slipped, it could destroy everything." In this way, secrecy spread like a contagion, infecting not only the astronauts, but the very walls of their homes. Children carried their own scars. Some spoke late of fathers who seemed distant, lost in thought, haunted by memories they would never share. Others remembered the sudden flare of anger when curiosity crossed invisible boundaries. To grow up in an astronaut's household was to live in two worlds: the bright, public dream shown on television, and the silent, private shadow that lingered behind closed doors. The psychological toll was immense. Depression, marital strain, and substance abuse haunted several Apollo families. Some marriages fractured, others endured only through unspoken understanding. Silence became both a shield and a prison. For the astronauts themselves, the family home was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to lay down the burdens of duty. But secrecy followed them inside, eroding intimacy, making even love feel watched. The mythology of Apollo was built on images of unity, smiling families waving from the sidelines of history. Yet those images were often masks. Behind them were tears, confusion, and the quiet ache of lives reshaped by secrets too heavy to hold. A home filled with silence is no home at all. It is only another chamber of secrecy, echoing with what cannot be spoken. While NASA stood as the public face of Apollo, another presence lingered in the shadows, one far less visible, but no less powerful: the intelligence community. From the very beginning, Apollo was not only a scientific mission, it was a Cold War operation. Every transmission, every photograph, every heartbeat sent from space had value, not just to historians, but to spies. The Soviet Union was listening. Rivals were watching. Information was both treasure and weapon, and so the guardians of secrecy stepped in. Men in dark suits could often be found at NASA facilities, though they seldom appeared in official photographs. Some came from the CIA, others from military intelligence branches, others from contractors whose names were never meant to be known. Their job was not to fly rockets. Their job was to manage information. They decided what was safe to release and what would remain buried. They monitored astronauts' words, combed through raw transcripts, and reviewed footage before the public ever saw it. Anomalies, strange lights, unexplained noises, ambiguous remarks were flagged, classified, or quietly edited. Sometimes the cover-up was subtle, a simple redaction. Other times it was heavier, an entire recording session sealed away, never to be acknowledged again. To the public, NASA was science. To insiders, it was also theater, its narrative carefully shaped, its vulnerabilities protected by invisible hands. There were whispers that intelligence officers even trained astronauts on what not to say. Certain experiences, should they occur, were to be described in coded language or not at all. Unidentified traffic, technical anomalies, visual disturbances, phrases that sounded routine but concealed extraordinary possibilities. The presence of intelligence did more than censor. It instilled fear. Astronauts knew their careers and even their families' safety depended on discretion. To break silence was not merely to defy NASA, it was to defy the government's most powerful apparatus. And for those tasked with the cover-up, the stakes were existential. If the world believed that Apollo astronauts had encountered something beyond human origin, craft not of this earth, the delicate balance of Cold War power might shatter overnight. Faith in science, in government, in the very narrative of progress could fracture. The intelligence community's role was not simply to protect secrets, but to protect stability itself. But in doing so, they blurred the line between stability and suppression, between protection and control. What began as safeguarding against Soviet ears grew into something else, a machinery of silence that consumed truths too strange to fit the official story. The deeper the secret, the stronger the guard, but sometimes the guard becomes the secret itself. Officially, the Apollo missions were broadcast in near real time. Millions of people gathered around their televisions, transfixed by ghostly images of astronauts walking the lunar surface, their voices echoing through static. It was hailed as the most transparent exploration in history, but behind the curtain, not everything reached the public intact. Technicians later whispered of blackouts, moments when live feeds were interrupted, sometimes explained as technical glitches, other times left unaddressed. In those gaps, transmissions continued, but not all of them were destined for public ears. Some were routed through secure channels, monitored by intelligence officers who decided what would be allowed into the history books. Take Apollo 11, for example. While Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin prepared to step onto the moon, reports surfaced of a medical channel, a supposedly private frequency where astronauts could speak without public broadcast. Some researchers claim that during one of these transmissions, the astronauts described objects on the crater's edge, observing them in silence, almost as if they were being watched. The official transcripts never recorded such words. But fragments, half-sentences, half-remembered testimonies suggest that something may have been said. Then there were the photographs. Thousands were taken, but not all were released. Some images appeared with strange artifacts, glowing orbs, odd reflections, or shapes that seemed mechanical, not geological. Critics were told these were lens flares, processing errors, or film anomalies. Yet former employees spoke of photo sessions where negatives were quietly pulled aside, sealed in envelopes marked classified. Apollo 12 brought another mystery. The crew's television camera was famously destroyed when it was pointed at the sun. A genuine accident or a convenient way to reduce live visuals after unexpected objects were reported in proximity. Intelligence had a hand in reviewing the mission afterward, and again, gaps emerged. Even mission transcripts, supposedly verbatim, show signs of careful editing. Pauses labeled as unintelligible, stretches of static, or moments when the recorded words don't align perfectly with the audio. Some suggest these were genuine signal issues. Others believe they were deliberate filters, redacting conversations that touched on encounters not meant for public awareness. The intelligence community excelled at plausible deniability. Technical failure, human error, equipment malfunction, each explanation sounded reasonable in isolation, but woven together, a pattern emerges, where strangeness threatened to surface, a convenient blackout or omission appeared. This process did more than protect secrets. It reshaped history. The Apollo missions we remember today may not be false, but they may not be complete. The record is a mosaic with missing tiles, gaps filled not with truth, but with silence. And silence, in its own way, tells a story. What history shows us is what someone once chose to keep. What it hides is often what matters most. For the astronauts, space was never silent. Every movement, every breath, every word was carried by radio, bouncing between lunar soil and earthbound control rooms. To the public, it seemed like freedom, the human voice traveling across 250,000 miles. But to the men inside the capsule, those words lived inside a cage. They knew they were being monitored. Every syllable, every pause, every slip of the tongue was recorded, analyzed, and, if necessary, filtered. They weren't just speaking to mission control. They were speaking to the unseen men behind the glass, the intelligence officers listening for anything that might threaten the narrative. Imagine the weight of that awareness. To describe what you saw honestly might mean career suicide. To admit that something hovered outside your window could end with your words struck from the record, your reputation tarnished, your family drawn into quiet investigations. So astronauts learn to speak in code, or not at all. Buzz Aldrin later admitted that he saw a light following Apollo 11 on its way to the moon, though at the time he couched his words in cautious, technical phrasing. Others used terms like unidentified traffic or bogey, phrases that sounded innocuous to the public, but carried deeper meaning to those trained to listen. Still, the knowledge that someone else controlled their voices gnawed at them. Astronauts were America's most celebrated heroes, yet they were never truly free to speak as men. Their words were property. Their experiences, filtered, scripted, polished, belonged not to them, but to history as written by others. In private, some astronauts confessed to feeling trapped. "You're the most watched man alive," one admitted, "and yet you can't say what you see." It was a prison of prestige. The higher the pedestal, the tighter the cage. The paranoia deepened when astronauts returned home. Many reported the sense of being followed, monitored, their personal conversations somehow less private. Wives noticed it too, the glance over the shoulder, the careful lowering of voices, the silence that fell when the phone line clicked strangely. This was more than professional secrecy, it was psychological erosion, a constant awareness that truth was dangerous, that even language itself had become a tool of control. To speak was to risk. To remain silent was to rot inside. For some, the solution was withdrawal. They buried the memories, avoided interviews, lived their lives as quietly as possible. For others, it meant coded remarks, brief slips in lectures or interviews, enough to hint, never enough to expose. And for a few, it meant carrying the burden until the end. Their words died with them, buried under medals, applause, and the heavy shadow of secrets that were never allowed to breathe. When even your voice is not your own, what part of you truly belongs to you? For decades, the official record of Apollo remained untouched, polished transcripts, archived footage, carefully curated photographs. But in the shadows, voices began to stir. They came not from podiums, but from quiet corners. Retired engineers, anonymous technicians, former intelligence officers, and even astronauts themselves. Men and women who carried fragments of a story too heavy to bear in silence. One such account came from Maurice Chatelain, a communications engineer who worked on Apollo systems. Long after retiring, he claimed that certain Apollo transmissions were deliberately withheld because they contained reports of craft observing the missions. His words were quickly dismissed, yet they never entirely disappeared. They lingered, echoing through UFO research circles like a faint signal returning from deep space. Then there were the so-called leaked transcripts. Copies circulated, often with smudged ink and missing pages, claiming to capture Apollo 11, describing giant objects watching them from the rim of a crater. Official sources denied their authenticity, but the language, technical, precise, filled with astronaut jargon, felt too real to ignore. Were they clever forgeries, or fragments of conversations once thought buried? Whistleblowers from within intelligence added another layer. Some admitted that part of their duty was to filter Apollo transmissions, flagging anything unusual for removal. One recalled, "It wasn't about lying, it was about control. We were told the public wasn't ready." Another described boxes of reels stored under lock and key, never catalogued in public archives. Even among the astronauts, subtle cracks appeared. Buzz Aldrin eventually acknowledged that Apollo 11 saw an object that could not easily be explained, though his words were later framed in the most cautious, skeptical light. Edgar Mitchell went further, openly stating in later life that UFOs were real and that a cover-up existed at the highest levels. Though Mitchell did not directly accuse NASA of hiding Apollo encounters, his credibility as a moonwalker gave new weight to suspicions. The most haunting aspect of these testimonies was not their content, but their tone. These were not wild declarations shouted for attention. They were quiet confessions, often delivered with the hesitancy of someone unburdening themselves late at night, fearing the consequences even years later. Whistleblowers spoke not as conspiracists, but as weary custodians of secrets too large for them to carry alone. And yet their words rarely pierced the mainstream. They were drowned by ridicule, dismissed as exaggeration, or lost in the flood of competing narratives. But for those who listened closely, the pattern was unmistakable, a steady trickle of voices, separate yet strangely aligned, all pointing toward the same unspoken truth. The cover-up was never airtight. It was porous, leaking in whispers, rumors, and fragments. And as with all leaks, once begun, it could never be fully stopped. Truth does not vanish when hidden. It waits, patient, like a star behind clouds, knowing the sky will clear. For years, the Apollo whispers remained like faint ripples across a vast ocean, noticed only by those who leaned close enough to hear. But then, in the 21st century, the world changed. Suddenly, UFOs, now rebranded as UAPs, were no longer fringe curiosities. They became headlines, congressional hearings, Pentagon reports. And with that shift, the old Apollo mysteries took on new resonance. When the U.S. Navy released cockpit footage of strange objects outmaneuvering advanced fighter jets, many researchers asked a simple question: if pilots are seeing these things today, what did astronauts see half a century ago? when they were alone on the frontier of space. The parallels were haunting. The same language appeared, objects packing the craft, lights maneuvering intelligently, phenomena defying explanation. Words spoken in 2020 echoed words whispered in 1969. It was as if the Apollo accounts, once buried, were resurfacing in new form, carried forward by a tide of vindication. Even government officials admitted the change. Intelligence briefings revealed decades of classified studies into UFOs, confirming what skeptics had long mocked. The phenomenon was real, persistent, and unexplained. If the government had hidden so much from military pilots, why not from astronauts too? For Apollo researchers, this was not just validation, it was revelation. Suddenly, claims once dismissed as fantasy now seemed plausible. Perhaps those lost transcripts were not so absurd. Perhaps those families, haunted by silence, were not exaggerating. The present was lending credibility to the past. Meanwhile, declassified documents trickled out. Files revealed that NASA collaborated closely with the Department of Defense during Apollo, especially regarding unknowns encountered in orbit. Though the documents never used the word extraterrestrial, their cautious phrasing hinted at more than simple equipment malfunctions. The mainstream media, once hostile to such ideas, began to tread carefully into the conversation. News anchors spoke the words unexplained aerial phenomena without laughter. Senators demanded answers. Pilots went on record. What had once been unspeakable was now undeniable. And so the question resurfaced. If NASA astronauts did encounter something extraordinary, had their experiences simply been buried, waiting for the world to catch up? Was the great cover-up not the denial of truth, but merely a delay stretching decades until society was ready to hear it? The Apollo missions, long frozen in history, were suddenly alive again, no longer just a story of the past, but a mirror held against the present. The whispers of 1969 now pulsed in rhythm with the revelations of today. History does not stay silent forever. Its echoes return, reshaped, reminding us that the past is never gone, it is only waiting. In recent years, something extraordinary has unfolded. Whistleblowers from within the modern military and intelligence community have stepped forward, speaking publicly about UFO encounters. Some have testified under oath, describing craft that defy physics, movements beyond human engineering, and programs hidden deep within classified budgets. To the casual observer, this is a new story, but for those who have spent years studying the Apollo whispers, it feels like déjà vu. The same patterns emerge, the same mechanisms of secrecy, the same language of denial, followed by reluctant acknowledgement. When David Grush, a former intelligence officer, declared that the U.S. had retrieved non-human craft, many thought of Apollo. If recoveries occurred in military programs, why would astronauts, the men who traveled farthest into the unknown, be exempt from encounters? If secrecy could shroud modern operations, why not lunar ones? Even the Navy's tic-tac footage bore eerie resonance with Apollo-era claims. Pilots described objects with no visible propulsion, darting with intelligence, responding as if aware of being watched. Compare that to Apollo astronauts allegedly describing traffic packing their spacecraft. Suddenly, the past and present no longer seemed separate. They rhymed. Whistleblowers have also described the machinery of suppression. Testimonies of threats, career sabotage, and the quiet removal of evidence mirror what Apollo engineers once hinted at. The methods of control appear unchanged, only the decades differ. Perhaps the most chilling form of vindication came not from testimony, but from silence. When Congress pressed military officials for answers, evasions followed. Classified settings were invoked. Questions were redirected. The refusal to deny outright left a void, one that seemed to confirm what could not be said. And that void looked very much like the gaps in Apollo's records, the blackouts, the missing reels, the words lost to static. For researchers of Apollo, this was the long-awaited echo. The hidden threads of history were weaving back into the present. What once seemed like scattered rumors now aligned with current evidence, each validating the other. But validation does not mean closure. If anything, it deepens the mystery. For if astronauts did encounter unknown craft, then what was their purpose? Why observe humanity's first steps into the cosmos? And why, after half a century, does secrecy still prevail? Vindication is bittersweet. It confirms suspicion, but it also confirms the machinery of silence, that some truths are guarded not for years, but for lifetimes. When the future begins to speak the same secrets as the past, we must ask, is it history that repeats or a mystery that never left? Half a century has passed since Apollo. The men who walked on the moon are now fading into history, their voices fewer each year, yet their story has not grown weaker with time, it has grown stranger. The official tale of triumph stands polished in textbooks, but around it, a parallel narrative has blossomed, a mythology. Whispers of hidden transmissions, of visitors on the crater rim, of lights packing spacecraft. These fragments, once fragile, have taken root in the imagination. They are repeated in books, whispered in late-night radio broadcasts, debated in dimly lit forums, woven into documentaries with hushed narration. Bit by bit, they have escaped the bounds of evidence and entered the realm of folklore. Every culture has its sky myths, the gods descending in fiery chariots, the ancestors watching from the stars, the tricksters who live in the heavens. For thousands of years, humanity has told stories of encounters with the otherworldly. Now, Apollo has joined that lineage. The astronauts are no longer just pilots and scientists. They are cast as reluctant heroes of a cosmic drama, figures who brushed against a forbidden truth and carried it back in silence. Legends thrive on what is missing, not on what is known, and Apollo offers plenty of gaps, the blackouts, the lost reels, the cautious words and unfinished sentences. Into those voids, imagination flows like water, shaping stories that are half memory, half myth. Was the moon truly barren? Did humanity's first steps into space also mark the first meeting with the unknown? For many, it no longer matters whether every rumor is factually true. What matters is the symbolism. Apollo becomes more than exploration, it becomes encounter. The legend whispers that when humanity dared to step beyond Earth, we were not alone. And that story, whether literal or metaphorical, resonates across cultures. Some see it as warning, that powers greater than us watched, ready to intervene. Others view it as invitation, a sign that we are part of a larger cosmic community waiting to be recognized. And some treat it as prophecy, suggesting that one day the truths buried in Apollo will rise, vindicated not by documents, but by destiny. This is how myths are born, not in the clarity of evidence, but in the twilight between silence and imagination. The Apollo encounters, whatever they truly were, now live in that liminal space. They are no longer just a question of history, they are part of humanity's timeless dialogue with the unknown. When facts are locked away, stories take their place, and sometimes stories carry truths that facts alone cannot hold. In the age of modern UAP disclosures, when the Pentagon acknowledges objects of unknown origin, when pilots testify before Congress, and when intelligence officers speak of hidden crash retrieval programs, one voice remains strangely quiet: NASA's. The agency that once stood at the frontier of exploration, the very institution whose astronauts whispered of strange encounters, now positions itself as a neutral bystander. Its spokespeople insist, "We have seen no evidence of extraterrestrial craft." The words are repeated, polished, deliberate. But listen closely, and you'll notice something. The denial is always framed with caution, evidence of extraterrestrial craft. A phrase so specific that it sidesteps the broader question of unidentified phenomena. NASA has launched new studies into UAPs, often emphasizing transparency. Panels of scientists gather, data is presented, yet the conclusions remain the same. We cannot explain these cases, but there is no proof of alien visitation. A sentence designed to soothe, yet one that leaves the core mystery untouched. Why this careful dance? Some argue it is institutional caution. NASA does not wish to appear unscientific by venturing into speculation. Others suggest it is habit, a continuation of the Cold Warrior discipline that required silence at all costs. And there are those who believe it is more direct, that the same invisible hands shaping Apollo's narrative still shape NASA's voice today. When pressed about Apollo-era rumors, NASA responds with practiced dismissal. No credible evidence, they say. The word credible does heavy lifting here. For what is credible? A leaked transcript, a retired engineer's testimony, a veteran astronaut's confession. Each is brushed aside as anecdotal, unreliable, unfit for the official record. And yet there is a tension in the air, for when NASA avoids the question too smoothly, too quickly, suspicion grows. The very act of evasion feeds the myth. The silence is no longer reassuring, it becomes suggestive. It whispers, there is something here, but we will not touch it. The public feels this. Trust in institutions has frayed in recent years, and NASA is not immune. Its careful language, once accepted without question, now fuels speculation. Each denial is read not as clarity, but as performance. In this way, NASA finds itself in an impossible position. To admit is to unravel history. To deny is to inflame doubt. And so it clings to the language of evasion, a vocabulary that is neither lie nor truth, but something in between. The words they do not speak are louder than the words they do. Even for those who never studied transcripts, never read leaked testimonies, never heard the whispers of engineers, the Apollo mystery has always been present, woven quietly into the collective subconscious. It lingers like a dream half remembered, shaping our imagination even when we cannot name its source. From the moment the first astronauts walked upon the moon, the public sensed more than what was shown. The grainy images, the static-laced voices, the long silences between transmissions, all of it carried an uncanny texture, as though something hovered just beyond the frame. People did not need leaked documents to feel it. The absence itself was a kind of presence. Over decades, that unease grew roots. It surfaced in films, novels, and television shows. Science fiction became a mirror of suspicion, stories of alien watchers, secret missions, astronauts confronted by the unknown. Hollywood dressed it in fantasy, but the cultural resonance came from somewhere deeper. The Apollo silence had planted seeds. Psychologists might call it a cultural haunting, a secret known but unspoken, absorbed not by individuals but by entire societies. It becomes myth disguised as memory. When children in the 1970s looked at the moon, they didn't just see dust and craters, they felt the possibility of company. They grew up asking not, is there life out there, but what are they not telling us? The effect runs deeper than curiosity. It shapes trust. The Apollo whispers, reinforced by years of government evasions, have eroded the boundary between belief and doubt. People no longer see institutions as transparent guardians of truth, but as gatekeepers of hidden realities. This skepticism, once marginal, is now mainstream. And yet the Apollo mysteries also carry inspiration. For many, the possibility that astronauts encountered the unknown transforms the moon landing into something greater than politics or technology. It becomes spiritual, a moment when humanity reached upward and touched the edge of the cosmic other. The legend grants Apollo a timelessness, a mythic aura that pure science alone could never achieve. This is the paradox of the Apollo cover-up, whether real or imagined. By hiding the truth, it may have given the story greater power. Secrecy turns fact into legend, and legends endure. Today, as UFOs re-emerge in the public discourse, people find themselves haunted by a sense of recognition. We have heard these stories before. We have dreamed them. Apollo was not just a mission, it was a doorway in the collective imagination, one that has never fully closed. A secret kept long enough ceases to belong to those who guard it. It becomes part of us all, living in the space between memory and myth. When the Pentagon admits to UAPs in 2020, when Navy pilots testify about objects defying physics, when Congress whispers of crash retrieval programs, there is a strange familiarity to it all. It is as though the story of Apollo has found its second act. The language is the same. Officials speak of unknowns, of anomalies, of objects not behaving within the laws of known aerodynamics. They reveal fragments while withholding the whole. They confirm the mystery without confirming its source. It is déjà vu, a repetition of the evasions once practiced during the moon missions. And the public feels it. They remember the gaps in the Apollo tapes, the rumors of censored transmissions, the astronaut interviews laced with cryptic pauses. When modern officials insist, "We don't know what these are," the echoes resound. The instinctive thought rises, "We've been here before." There is irony in this. Apollo was once the crown jewel of American transparency, broadcast to millions, heralded as proof that exploration was open to all. Yet it may have been, in truth, the beginning of a long tradition of carefully sculpted narratives. The Apollo silence laid the template. What is not said becomes as important as what is. And now, as governments reluctantly admit there is something in our skis, people look backward. They ask, if they withheld the truth then, what are they still hiding now? Did Apollo reveal not just a technological triumph, but a moment of cosmic contact too monumental to disclose? The timelines align eerily. Reports of UFO encounters surged during the Apollo era, just as the world's eyes turned skyward. Whispers of astronauts speaking of visitors found their way into tabloids, into late-night radio, into hushed conversations between those who claim to know more. Today's revelations are not separate. They are threads woven into the same fabric. And perhaps that is the chilling realization. The Apollo cover-up was not an isolated act. It was the opening chapter of a narrative still unfolding. Each new declassified video, each leaked government memo, each congressional testimony feels like a ripple returning to that first stone cast upon the moon's surface. Apollo was where humanity stepped beyond Earth. Perhaps it was also where we first stumbled into the gaze of something older, something watching. And if that is true, then the silence of Apollo was never just about the past. It was preparation for the future, a blueprint for how to manage truths too vast, too destabilizing, to ever be spoken plainly. The echoes of silence are not bound to history. They stretch forward, shaping the way tomorrow will be told. The Apollo program ended half a century ago. The rockets were retired, the astronauts aged, the missions became grainy footage replayed in documentaries and classrooms. Yet the silence surrounding what may have been witnessed has never ended. It lingers like a presence just beyond the frame, like the shadow on a photograph that no one can quite explain. Every testimony, every rumor, every dennied transcript adds not just to history, but to myth. And myths, unlike facts, do not fade with time. They grow. Apollo began as proof of human ingenuity, a triumph of science, politics, and courage. But in the years since, it has become something else. A story that refuses to be only history, a riddle hidden in plain sight. a whispered legend of astronauts who may have glimpsed something too vast to speak aloud. And maybe that is why it endures, because deep down people feel it. The moon was never just rock and dust. It was a stage upon which humanity brushed against the unknown. Today, as governments and militaries release videos of craft that bend physics, as pilots describe encounters that defy explanation, the Apollo mystery grows sharper. If this is what we admit now, what did they see then? What was recorded in those transmissions that we will never hear? Perhaps the truth lies in vaults, guarded by silence, awaiting a future when humanity is ready. Or perhaps the truth is already here, hidden not in files, but in us, in the way the Apollo legends haunt dreams, in the way the moon feels alive with mystery whenever we look at it. Because in the end, maybe disclosure is not an announcement. Maybe it is a slow awakening, a recognition that the secrets have been with us all along, scattered in testimony, buried in rumor, etched into culture, carried quietly within the silence itself. And so the Apollo story becomes timeless, not just a chapter of history, but a myth we carry forward, a reminder that the moment we reached out into the cosmos, something may have reached back. If the astronauts saw what the whispers claim, then Apollo was never just about reaching the moon. It was about crossing a threshold humanity was not prepared to cross. A door was opened, and no matter how tightly it has been held shut, its outline remains, etched into the human imagination, waiting. Perhaps the greatest cover-up is not in the files locked away, but in the silence that drifts between the stars, a silence that tells us we are not alone and never were. The moon hangs above us still, patient, luminous, eternal. The question remains suspended there too, unspoken but undeniable. What do they truly see? And now, after all the whispers, the silences, the contradictions, and the shadows, the story rests with you. Perhaps the astronauts saw nothing more than stars refracted by their visors. Perhaps the rumors were distortions, misheard static turned into legends. Or perhaps they stood upon the moon and found themselves under the gaze of something watching, something that followed them home, woven forever into our silence. We will never know for certain, not because truth is absent, but because it is scattered. Fragments hidden in vaults, fragments in memories of men who have long passed, fragments in the spaces between official denials and reluctant admissions. And in that scattering, the burden shifts. The truth is no longer just NASA's to guard or governments to lock away. It now belongs to us, listeners, dreamers, seekers. Because when enough people carry a secret in their imagination, it becomes more powerful than any official record. You feel it, don't you? That pull. The sense that the moon is not only rock and shadow, but story and silence. That Apollo was never just about reaching space. It was about touching the unknown and returning with a secret too vast to speak aloud. What you do with that secret is the question. You can dismiss it, file it away as rumor, and let the silence win. Or you can hold it close, share it, and keep the legend alive. Because maybe that is disclosure, not a press conference or a headline, but the spreading of whispers until they shape the world. And so I leave you with this. When silence grows heavy enough, it speaks. The moon waits above, unchanged, timeless, but you here now are part of the story. The listener becomes the keeper, the dreamer becomes the witness. Will you carry it forward, or let it fade into the static of forgotten transmissions? The choice, as always, is yours.